Texas has a Texas Historical Commission, which oversees all historical antiquities, oversight of how to protect all monuments in the state of Texas and our history itself. Today, we have one of those commissioners.
Oh dear.
Right.
And he is a gentleman.
One's too many.
And a scholar. And so today you're going to hear about what the THC does, but also about the roads that make us great in the Bankhead Highway. And so you'll learn about the Bankhead, but also why it's important and what the commission does, and why it's important for all of you to be involved in reporting our history. And so with that, please welcome my friend, the great Gravelle.
Listen to that
Right up here. And if you got a microphone,
You
you
can
just come up right here, and you have that microphone.
there so I can hear.
Yep.
Right? Well, you can. Yeah.
You can also adjust the microphone, David, if you need
Thank
to.
you. Sir, appreciate it. You don't sit here. Well, thank you. Just as a note, the THC couldn't do very much were it not for county historical commissions. We're kind of like the bedrock of the program. It's from the CHCs that a lot of work comes to us to deal with. The commission itself has multiple tentacles. We have an active archaeological program. We have an active architecture program. We manage 35 or 36 historic sites across the state. So, for example, San Jacinto, we are the managing operating group there. Washington on the Brazos, San Felipe to Austin, Goliad, some of the western forts like Lancaster and Griffin, some houses like San Maxie, like Dwight Eisenhower's birthplace in Denison, like Sam Rayburn's house. Those are all historic sites that we manage, and there's a lot of them. Goodnight Ranch on your way to Amarillo, that's one of ours. The George Bush Childhood Home in Midland is also one of our sites. And there's more than that. So we operate them, and we also improve them. So for example, in some of those sites, we are actually adding visitor centers so that you can see an interpretation of life as it might have been during those in those sites, but also just the breadth of history that happened there. So San Jacinto's got really a long run history, and the visitor center will have a narrative for that. So all of that is managed through our historic sites program. We have archaeologists on staff who have made discoveries like the Lavelle, that would be LaSalle's ship that sank in Matagorda Bay. It is now the centerpiece exhibit in the Bob Bullock Museum. We discovered it through our maritime program. We essentially built a coffer dam around it, pumped out all the water, and then found the remains of the ship and preserved it, brought it out, took it to Texas A&M where it was preserved so that it could be brought out into the air, basically. Got all the artifacts off it. We actually found some remains on it. And it is, like I mentioned, it's now the centerpiece exhibit at the building. But we were the ones that did that. And we raised the money privately to do it. We didn't ask the state to make a contribution. We went out and raised the money ourselves. We did that. We found a project I was involved in was the discovery of the grave of a man named James Cordell. If you're familiar with Texas history in like the 1830s or so, he was a very famous Texas Ranger. He was a contemporary of Jim Bowie's. He was posted at near Marlin, Texas. There was a fort there that overlooked the Brazos. He was posted there as a ranger. He was killed by Indians and buried. And he was lost to history, basically. It's in Gravelle County is named for him. Gravelle River is named for him. He was a big deal back then, but he was killed and no one knew where he was. Well, we got a foundation in Dallas to buy the property that this fort was on, and in the process of doing that, we found these giant river stones. They were huge. They were about that big. They were not indigenous to the area. They were indigenous to the river, which was about 300 yards down a hill. So somebody had to cart those things up and put them on the grave. We knew that because Indians did that to keep the spirit down. So it was the Indians who killed him, and then he was buried, and then they brought these stones to keep his spirit in the grave. So that was a grave. We didn't know whose it was. And we excavated it, brought in some help from the Smithsonian. Again, this was done privately, and we dug down and found remains at the bottom of the grave shaft. We took samples of DNA from the hip, which is where it's supposed to be the place that it exists for the longest amount of time. We found a relative of James Cordell, a 92-year-old woman who lived in Ohio. We were able to swab the inside of her cheek and try to match the DNA. They didn't match. So we were a little lost on that, but the remains went back to the Smithsonian for further analysis. And what they found was when Cordell had been killed, he had been scalped. And when they brought him back to the fort, they put a bandana around the wound, and on the back they put some copper tacks to hold it in place. Well, copper doesn't deteriorate, and so there was DNA under those tacks. That was then compared to the DNA we had, and voila, it was him. He was a Cordell. His remains are still in Washington. But anyway, we do stuff like that so that history comes alive. Otherwise, it's in a book. But there's a real grave shaft, and he was a real guy, and there we have images of his remains and all of that. Had that not been discovered, that would just be a footnote to history. It would be in the book, but it's real now, and that has a lot to do with the importance of historic preservation. It brings things back to life. It brings their story back to life, so that you can understand it. At that point, you can see what happened. You can understand it yourself and see it from the point of view of the artifact. And I'll be talking about that later. The Bankhead Highway. Anybody know what the Bankhead Highway is? Have an idea? Some of you do. The Bankhead Highway was a transcontinental highway that was built that connected Washington, D.C. all the way to San Diego. 3,000 miles. And this was done in the 20s. There was not, there was only one transcontinental highway at that point, which was called the Lincoln Highway, which essentially took the upper Midwest and went from west to east. It was for all of these newfangled things called automobiles. A lot of the Lincoln was not paved. The Bankhead was paved. That made it a big deal. The idea of the Bankhead was to come from Washington, D.C. and take kind of a southern way of getting from one coast to the other. It was called Bankhead, by the way, because the senator who created the program and led the funding, his name was Philip Bankhead, and he was a senator from Alabama. And by the way, he made sure it ran through Alabama. Once it was announced and the general route was announced, cities and towns along the route promoted themselves, wanted to make a part of, build their town essentially around the Bankhead Highway. And so it ran through 14 states. And I'm just going to read it to you. D.C., Virginia, well, DC state, is it? And that's a good thing. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, I said Arkansas, didn't I? Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So you can see it kind of went like this, whereas Lincoln had gone almost directly across, bisected the country. There are 850 miles of the Bankhead Highway in Texas. And I'm going to kind of give you an idea of the towns that it ran through. You'll be familiar with some of the towns because this is one of them. A lot of towns like Rockwall, like it started in Texarkana. It came through Mount Vernon. It came through Mount Pleasant. It came through Sulphur Springs. You can see the route. It came through Greenville. It came into Rockwall. It proceeded through Rockwall, and John's going to tell you a lot more about that, about the specifics of where it may or may not exist in this county. We went through Rockwall. It was submerged by Lake Ray Hubbard, although there is part of it that is above water. John Adams, my buddy here, you shouldn't seriously listen to him, but when he comes up and talks about it, he's going to talk about the familiar streets that kind of are part of the Bankhead Highway. It went through Dallas, and when it did, it went down Commerce Street. It went right through Deep Ellum. If you visualize Deep Ellum, you can see those buildings are of the period of the 20s and the 30s, basically. So that those businesses were built as a result of the Bankhead Highway. It continued out and ran by Old Red, the courthouse. It ran across the Trinity. There's parts of the bridge that the railing of the bridge is still standing. So it did that. It ran up to Grand Prairie. It ran to Fort Worth. It went west. It went to Abilene. And there's the historic district in Abilene, which is really a great one, was all built as a result of the Bankhead Highway. It went on across there. It went to all the way out to Van Horn, and then it went to El Paso, and then it went to New Mexico. And so the towns that are mentioned, and there's far more than that, Cisco, Albany, all of those towns were all built to take advantage of this traffic that was going to be on the Bankhead Highway. There are historic districts that are still, that you can still see that were built because of the Bankhead. I mentioned Abilene. Deep Ellum it's eerie how much it looks like. The architecture looks similar to that period of time. It went to Lake Cliff, which is Oak Cliff, Lancaster, Mineral Wells, Sweetwater, ran right through the rattlesnakes. Thurber, if you've ever seen Thurber on the way out to Abilene, it ran by Thurber. And then the West End in Dallas was driven by the Bankhead Highway, basically. There are tons of courthouses that are there. This is one. Old Red is one. There's one in Franklin County, Mount Vernon, Hopkins County, Sulphur Springs, Hunt County, Greenville, Parker County, West Weatherford, Shackelford County, Albany. If you've never seen the Albany courthouse, it's a treat. You ought to get off I-20 and go take a look at it. It's magnificent. Stevens County, Breckenridge, and Taylor, which is Abilene. And there are more that as you go west. Those are the central ones. It was a historic notion in America at the time it was built. And it was built primarily for convenience, so people could go from one place to the other. But it was also built for economic development, and so businesses were built on the highway. Do you remember those days when businesses were actually built on the highway as opposed to being bypassed, which was It's what happened later as cars got faster and people didn't want to drive through the stoplights, and so they bypassed towns. And so that fundamentally changed. But the Bankhead went right through the towns, and a lot of towns were built up around it. So that's a little kind of an overview of the Bankhead. I've got up here, I wish I had labeled to make a slide, but we've got a picture in the brochure that shows the portion of Bankhead that is not submerged, was not submerged by Lake Gravelle. It's pretty interesting. I think John says a fish out there.
Yeah, big fish up.
You want to come up and talk a little bit about how it goes through Rockwall?
I don't have a whole lot to say, so I'll be short.
Good.
Got these
Yes.
Rockwall
There
maps
is
here.
a portion of the Bankhead Highway that you can still see, out there, if you're out going out 20 towards Abilene, right when you go up Ranger Hill.
Right.
The new, residue they have, they designated off a little spot,
Right.
and there's a plaque there that says, hey, this is where the Bankhead Highway came through.
Well, every now and then you'll see a sign that has, it's yellow, it's a street sign that says BH, and that means Bankhead Highway. It's not a program of ours, it just, the different counties did it. And, I've seen it in Midland, of all places. I was driving down the highway there, I looked over, and there was a frontage road that said Bankhead Highway on it. Anyway, it had a lot to do with the development of this part of the United States. John?
Yeah, that, if you notice on the west side there of that map, this is an older map that doesn't have stuff we recognize a lot, but on the west side comes in out of the lake where that Veterans Memorial is right there. But the outcropping is, David has that picture, if you go, you've all seen it go across 66 and it's over on the right hand side of the bridge that comes up out of the water, that's part of it. That's what that picture is he has.
And you have to pass this around, but here's the
But,
picture of it.
and I drove out to the eastern side. Of course, we're still 6 or 8 miles from the county line from here because the county line's in, out where Bucky's is, out to 30 out there. So of course, John King is not on here, but right there where that little street comes down off the airport road, I think that's where the service center is right now. Rockwall County, Rockwall City Service Center. So John King would be right there. And, Park Place and all those other places are filled in there, but that's basically where it comes in from the east, goes out across the lake.
We did 66, obviously intersection was 66 there, so is this old 66?
I'm sorry.
Highway 66,
Yeah, 66 is that green.
that's the existing.
Yeah, it's existing. So it kind of doubled up right there on the west side, and then came back out of it right there at Washington Street. To Washington all the way out to the airport there, and down through there, so. Very interesting. I never heard of the Bankhead Highway until David sent this email the other day.
I needed a scout. John's a good one. We were in the Army together.
Yeah.
We were pretty sorry individuals. Mark also asked me to talk about my favorite topic, which is just historic preservation and what is the meaning of that. A lot of people use to me it's kind of a hackneyed phrase that people who forget the history are doomed to repeat it. I don't necessarily believe that because I don't think it captures the spirit of what historic preservation is about. Here's what I think it is. We have just recently in the last week a very dramatic example of the power of historic preservation, and that would have been the opening of the cathedral at Notre Dame. I don't know if you looked at the pictures of that, it is stunning. It is magnificent. It is breathtaking. And the decision that the French had to make after the fire was interesting because it was a building, if you didn't have the willpower for history, you would have torn it down because it was compromised. he came up with the idea of building an all-new, modern, with modern technology and all of that, and rebuilding it in that way. The French people said, "Not on your life, buddy. You ain't doing that. We're going to rebuild the cathedral in the historic sense. We're going to not even reimagine it. We're going to build it like it was, and we're going to make it stronger, and we're going to make it better." And that is exactly what happened. It took them 5 years to do it. That it is a task. I don't see how they did it, because they had to bring in specialists in wood, and they had to get the wood. They even went and got the wood from the same forest that the original wood came out of. They had people that had to recreate a lot of the stonework that happened and all of that. And they were very particular about it. And thank God they weren't. The French have a phrase, and will probably mangle the French here, but it's called lieu de mémoire. And lieu de mémoire means sites of memory. So, if you just think about that part of it, just that phrase, it means I see something, I see a place, I see an artifact, I see something, and it evokes a memory, and it evokes a narrative. And that is the importance of historic preservation right there. It is our belief that those memories should be preserved, something should be preserved that evokes those memories, so that a narrative can be written. A narrative for like a roadside marker even. It does that. It stands for what happened there, and it brings that memory back to life. And it's not a book memory. It's not ours. It's a real see it, touch it, stand in it, breathe it in memory. It's one of those. And in this way, the people who are part of that memory, in a sense, coming back to life. Whereas otherwise, they would have been in the book. And there's nothing wrong with the book. I read them all the time. But that is the importance of what you do, and that's the importance of what we do. And this is the way we look at it. So that historic preservation is not just about saving it, even though that's the first step. That's the thing that brings it back to life, brings the memories and the stories back to life. The story becomes real, and that's our theme line is real places telling real stories in Texas. So that if you go to Notre Dame today, you can see the same area that Joan of Arc was beatified, or Napoleon was crowned, or the liberation of France from the Nazis was celebrated by Charles de Gaulle in Notre Dame. And that's what Notre Dame thinks of it. That was why when I came up with the idea of rebuilding it, people said not on your life, because it represents the soul of France, I believe. There is also, and John and I talked about this, purportedly they have a reliquary, which are things that hold sacred objects. There's a reliquary there that has the original crown of thorns that Christ wore on the cross. It was retrieved by a pope later and saved throughout all that time, and it came and it's in Notre Dame. If you can believe the provenance of it, that's always something about history you have to be careful of. So, by you and I being able to see that and see its reality, then Christ's story comes back to life. So everything about that, pain, death, hope, resurrection, all of that, you can see that story right there in front of you. If that didn't exist, if Notre Dame didn't exist, you would be reading the Bible about it or listening to a sermon about it. But here it is, right there where you can see it. The size of the story, Notre Dame is a grand story, but the size of the story really doesn't matter to historic preservation. It can be a house, it can be a business, it can be a cemetery that you guys are working on. And the memory, once that cemetery is completed, it will be marked, and when it is marked, the narrative of what is in there and why it was built will be there right in your face. Otherwise, it would just be a half an acre of somebody's yard. But now it will be marked, and we will be honoring the people who were buried there. And I understand there were veterans, primarily in black soldiers. That is particularly important because those kinds of cemeteries really fall by the wayside. So, to kind of sum this up, we wouldn't be here talking about this in this beautiful courthouse were it not for the people who came before us. The sacrifices that they made, that you have built the town of Rockwall because of it. And their memory should be represented. It should be honored. There's a hymn that uses this phrase that I just love, which is, they call it the Mystic Sweet Communion. You know which book that one comes from, John? Foundation, Humani Foundation is our God. And there's a line in there that says the Mystic Sweet Communion. So in that sense, we by resurrecting these memories, we come into communion with them. If you believe that. If you don't believe it, that won't matter to you, but I believe it. And so that's what I think is the importance of it. I think that's the business we're in. I think that's why it's so important. It's a hard business to be in because somebody wants to tear it down and build something on top of it that's not historic. And those memories go away. They end up in a book or something like that. But because the thing exists, like this does, you have a chance to tell the stories of the things that happened here. And that's my speech.